my name is Alex Kladner, and on behalf of the DC Baha'i Assembly, I welcome you to the DC Baha'i Center. The Baha'is gather here every Sunday informally to converse on several spiritual topics. Today we'll be hearing from Lex Musta. Lex's topic is Reflections upon the Baha'i Influence upon Race, Amity in America. Alain Locke, Robert Abbott, and the 1921 Race Amity Conference. And I'll start by introducing our speaker, Lex Musta. Lex is an independent researcher whose work focuses on the role of social meanings in shaping race relations. He completed his MBA studies in Paris at Schiller International University. In his latest publication, co-authored with Dr. Roshan Danesh, is Some Reflections on Baha'i Approaches to Social Change, which is available at BahaiLibrary.com. Additionally, he's recently published a book review upon Louis Gregory and Race Amity, which is the book review is also available on the BahaiStudies.Canada. That book is titled Champions of Oneness, Louis Gregory and His Shining Circle, and that was written by Janet Rue. Lastly, on April 1st and 15th, Lex will be leading the First Americans Tour, and the sign-up is available at dctimetravelsTour.com. With that being said, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for that introduction. It's an honor to speak with you all today, and I'd like to each turn to your neighbor and thank them for coming. I'm also thankful. I'd also like to thank my wife Tori and my daughter Adisu, who've been kind enough to make the journey with me today at the back.
Great to see you again. I thought it was
Hi there. Nice to see you.
And I'd like to also acknowledge the Anacostan First Nation on whose territory we're meeting today, who were custodians of this land for 300 generations, which is something to get your mind around, to realize how long they've been here. And similarly, in my own background in Estonia, my ancestors have been in the country of Estonia for a similar time period. And about 28 years ago, an amazing thing happened there. 1/3 of my entire country got together in one place to sing together, to sing for their freedom. Things were looking so dark that they could see the end. If things continued the way they're going, they would disappear like so many other indigenous nations in this world. So they had the bravery to begin singing. And the song they sang was, you have to just imagine this big festival ground that was actually made for singing. So you got to imagine 300,000 people there. And they sang, Islane olenya, Islane yen, Nego Isla six lodi, Islane olen uhkeya ya, Nego vari samodi. And the Soviet, police and so on were struck. This is not supposed to be happening. We're in control. So they shut off the speaker system. They had the brass band play up some Soviet song. But with 300,000 voices, you cannot drown it out. So let me repeat again what they kept singing, but this time in English. Estonian I am, Estonian I'll stay, like I was created. Estonian I am, proud and good, like my forefathers before me. And they just sang again and again, and their courage was building. You have to just imagine, this is things you could not start singing. They began digging out of the earth flags that had been buried for 50 years, illegal flags, and began waving them, the color of this flag on my ring here. So you start seeing flags you haven't seen in 50 years waving, and all this uprising energy. And within 3 years, the country was free, without firing a single bullet against a nuclear superpower. So don't ever think anything is impossible. So I had to rush over there. My country is free. This is impossible. So we rush over there, and I look around, and a feeling, I'll tell you how you can try to imagine how I felt. Has anyone yet been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture? Something like that. Because all of a sudden, behind glass is me. On the pedestal is me. I mean, this is impossible feeling. So if you haven't been to that museum, once you go there, you have some feeling of what I felt like. And in that museum, there was the boat, little tiny boat that my family took to cross a sea, the Baltic Sea, to get to freedom. You know, so that my family didn't get killed, because there was a huge genocide that followed in 41 to 43. And you see the boat, and you're like, this boat is tiny. And then you see the uniform of my great-uncle Johan, as he was a forest guerrilla fighter fighting for freedom. Estonians kept fighting in the forests from, imagine, from 41 to 1979, the last one was caught. You know, so they were fighting this campaign for freedom. And then, amazingly, you know, having museums like that allowed them to do things that aren't normally done. Here's a book of all the genocide victims. You know, so now you have your own museum, you can produce it. And then I'm able to find my family. And my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Matt Giddick, I get to finally find out when he died 2 days ago, on February 8th, 1943, in Novorossiysk, Russia. So now, thanks to this, I can one day go there and put a grave for him. You know, these are the kinds of feelings you get when you have that freedom. And I said, as long as I'm here, I'm feeling so great, let me go to visit the Baha'is. What are the Baha'is doing in Estonia? They must have Baha'i prayer books in Estonian, and they must be singing in Estonian. The Estonians are always singing. And I go there, and wait a second, there's some Russians here. These are the people I've been taught my whole life to fear, to hate. They've taken everything away from me. They killed my great-grandfather. But they were nice. They're working with the Estonians for mutual advancement. They're loving the Estonians. They're honoring the Estonians. I'm like, wow. You know, my wife all knew this already, because Mayor Marion Berry of BC sent my wife to Russia when she was 16 with her schoolmates to experience Russia. These Russians are beautiful people. You have to get to know them and not just hear the propaganda that people who don't like them would say. And so I had this experience, and I'm flying back on the plane to America, and I'm saying, what I just witnessed in that amazing reunion there, can that be spread across the whole country? I mean, do Baha'is have the capacity to teach all Estonians and Russians to get along like that? You know, we all saw in Ukraine that hasn't happened. Can Estonia do it different? So they love each other like this? And so as I got thinking about that, I realized, wait a second, we're a new Estonian Baha'i community. Well, let's go back 105 years here in DC. Right? It was just a new community, 2 decades old. They were still just finding their feet. When Abdul Baha visited here, the leader of the Baha'i faith, the son of Baha'u'llah. And he did many things here, but one thing that really struck me over at Howard University, he taught something that like I witnessed in Estonia. He said, well, you have diversity on the one hand, you have to cherish diversity. He used the word, become very loving towards the other, enhance the honor of the other. So clearly, there's an aspect of us which is nurturing, just like these Russians were nurturing Estonians. You know, he said, nurture the African American. But he also said you must mix together completely. So there's also this unity aspect. So we have this strange dynamic that Baha'is have to deal with of being united but not being the same. And so let's explore a little bit today. How did the community then take this message from Abdul Baha and share it? And did they have a national influence? Well, as soon as Abdul Baha finished here in DC, he was very busy. The whole country wanted to hear from him. Ida B. Wells, who many of you know, is one of the great leaders against lynching. In the 25 years before Abdul Baha's visit, 2,600 African Americans had been terrorized and lynched. And so they decided in Chicago to hold a conference of religious leaders. What do religious leaders have to say about lynching? And Abdul Baha was invited. Ida B. Wells had the foresight to invite Abdul Baha to be there. And what did he say at this anti-lynching conference? Well, what's so interesting is you read all the great people who spoke. W.E. Du Bois spoke there. The grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, who was then the editor of the New York Post, spoke. Many great speakers spoke. But what Abdu'l-Baha's unique mention, which was repeated afterwards when people quote the talk, is that he said, whose heart is pure is better. Whereas everyone else was speaking about equality and stopping these things, he actually said an African American could be better if his heart is pure. Whoever's heart is pure can be better. So he gave a direct spiritual challenge. And there was a young reporter in the audience, Mr. Robert Abbott. And Mr. Robert Abbott is a very interesting individual who was coming here to report on Abdu'l-Baha's talk. His two parents had been liberated from enslavement 4 years before he was born. He was in the coast islands of Georgia, so they were liberated a little bit earlier in the war because the U.S. Navy was overpowering over the Confederacy, so they were freed up. But sadly, in 1870, his father died when he was just 1. He didn't know his father. But his mother had been working in a German store, so she had learned German. And she married, the year after, in 1870, a German African-American. Who's ever heard of that in 1870? How did that happen? Well, this gives you a sense of the kind of upbringing Mr. Abbott had that brought him to the seat in front of Abdu'l-Baha. His father, in 1847, saw Tama on this auction block and had pity on her. And said, I'm going to liberate this woman from enslavement and marry her. So he married her, but then he recognized the situation in the U.S. in 1847, and he didn't want his children to grow up there, so he sent them to his homeland of Germany. So you literally have this African-German family growing up in Germany. So you start to get a sense of Mr. Abbott's special, quite unique upbringing, having family connections to Europe. But not only that, he also, this stepfather, Mr. Stackhouse, Mr. Senstack, he also was a preacher, and he taught there's only one church, and it's for all races. So he had all this in his head as he sat there. So he went on to Hampton Institute, learned to become a printer. He went on to Kent Law School, class of 1898, and he became a lawyer. But he said, you know what my contribution is going to be? I'm going to defend my race with a newspaper.
Wow.
And with 25 cents, he founded a newspaper.
Wow.
And Abdu'l-Baha walked over to him, put his hand on his head, and said, one day I will get a great service from you for the benefit of humanity.
Wow.
It was in 1912. And boy, did he deliver. Right away from that conference, he published the only newspaper picture of that conference that was published anywhere in the world. He even said that in his byline. He goes, the only picture ever published by anyone in the world. And he calls that conference, a bold strike was made to down race prejudice. He actually put that in the description. He recognized that. And you can see W.E.B. Du Bois in the picture right beside Joseph Hannen. Those of you who are familiar with some Baha'i history, Joseph Hannen and his family were the first to teach African Americans here in D.C. in 1902. He was so successful, it's hard to imagine in your mind. 1 in 9 African Americans read his paper, 1 million.
Wow.
He was the richest African American in the whole country. He was such a leader that if you lived back in 1912, 1915, you would see his names right up there with A. Philip Randolph, Marcus Garvey, and W.E.B. Du Bois. That's how huge he is. If you go to that museum I was just talking about, there's a whole wall for him there. Very few people get a whole wall in the museum. He's one of them. And he taught just the message that Abdu'l-Baha taught. He taught both the diversity, the upliftment, and the unity. So let me just briefly say how he did this. If you just wrap your mind around the most popular newspaper in the entire country, the one that everyone passes around. He wasn't content just to have a large newspaper. He wanted it in Mississippi, in Alabama, in his own Georgia. How do you get a paper there? Right? I mean, this is talking about 1915. I mean, it was still 50 years before the 60s. He snuck it in on the trains, because Chicago was a train depot. So the Pullman car porters would sneak it down, and he would let they make salesman money. So he literally was distributed throughout the South. 70% of his paper was outside of Chicago. His paper, as the custom was at the time, you would say Louis Gregory, comma, black, or Robert Abbott, colored in the newspaper. He didn't do that. He would call all African Americans race men and race women. He created a complete different mindset by using words. Langston Hughes himself credits Robert Abbott with making him a race man. We all think about Langston Hughes, oh, he knows all about African American rights and so on. But he credits Mr. Abbott's teaching us the words, the thoughts of how to be a race man. He led the Great Migration. In May 1917, he said specifically, I've bought trains, they're waiting for you, I've paid for full cars, I'm the richest man, I can do this. Come on up, escape sharecropping, escape virtual enslavement, come to the north. And he created the largest immigration in American history. 4 million African Americans left the South, virtual imprisonment, to virtual freedom, not complete freedom obviously, up in the north. That was the great movement. That was the great drive. Baha'i Dr. Alain Locke credits him, calls this the spiritual emancipation of the African American. Yes, we all know in 1865 we were physically emancipated. But here in Maryland, just take Maryland for example, they were emancipated November 1st, 1864. You try and plant something in November in Maryland. So you can clearly not feed your family. You had no choice. You had to accept whatever contract the prison camp would give you. You don't have just a freedom to go off and be free when you can't plant in the winter of 1864. As throughout the South, the choices were the same. So Alain Locke called this the spiritual emancipation of the African American. That's the difference between living in sharecropping and then earning your own wage in the mills of Chicago and elsewhere. And of course, he didn't stop there. He gave guidance. His paper kept giving you guidance, what you do once you arrive there. So clearly, he was a man who uplifted, loved, and honored the race men and the race women. But on the opposite side, unity. He did something no other Baha'i in the entire world has achieved. In his lifetime, he printed 145 articles about the Baha'i faith in the largest circulation newspaper serving African Americans in the country. On Christmas Day, 1915, he said, I'm going to print, here's the title he gave it, The Wonder Story of Abdu'l-Baha and His Followers' Attitude Towards the Black Man, the World Over, exclusively in the Chicago Defender beginning January 1st, 1916. That year, every single week, he published a full, unedited tablet of Abdu'l-Baha. No other newspaper in America since or before has ever done that. I don't think anywhere in the world any Baha'i has been successful at getting a full-page, unedited tablets of Abdu'l-Baha, running full page. Every week for a whole year, reaching Mississippi, Alabama. What effect could have that had on an entire nation? Incalculable. If I could say myself, if I want to do one thing today, I want everyone in D.C. to read a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha. I could not do it. Robert Abbott did it. We cannot say that he did not contribute significantly to the unity, not just to building up. What did it say every time on the front page of the paper? Across the masthead? American race prejudice must be destroyed. The newspaper said that every day in Alabama, every day in Mississippi, every day in Texas. So, I'll just close on one last thought about that. The first article that ever published, can anyone guess who the author was? Anyone hazard a guess?
Louis Gregory?
Yes! Unedited.
Yes.
He just put the words in on April 13th, to lay the groundwork for that conference we talked about. And Louis Gregory slipped this in there. The Baha'i faith has more promise of being the real solution of the race problem than anything ever seen or heard of before. What a platform to be read by everyone in the country, the definitive text. So, that's just unbelievable. In 1937, the Chicago Defender itself described Mr. Abbott's faith in the March issue. It is well known that Mr. Abbott holds a deep desire in his embrace of the Baha'i faith because it strives for the full culmination of unity in all of its teachings and for the establishment of a new world order that expounds the oneness of all races, one faith, and universal peace. And on a very personal note, Louis Gregory, in his great role as a historian, recorded these words that Mr. Abbott once said when he declared his faith. I have been praying to God all my life to see these who recognize me as a man. With those words, he declared his faith in Baha'u'llah. And he said, save my people, and he goes, save America from herself. That's how he finished off. So, while Dr. Alain Locke called Mr. Abbott the spiritual emancipator of all African Americans, a person no less than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on March 9th, 1968, called Dr. Alain Locke the philosopher every African American should know. Because I don't want African Americans to be walking around thinking only Plato and Aristotle are philosophers. We are philosophers. Alain Locke is a philosopher, and Dr. Martin Luther King thought to sought only his name and W.E.B. Du Bois' name out. He spent only those two names that he mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about who is Dr. Alain Locke, who called Mr. Abbott the spiritual emancipator of an entire race. So Dr. Alain Locke, born about 20 years later than Mr. Abbott. His father was graduate of class of 1879, second class of Howard Law School. So that's his father's side, right? One of the first lawyers in the whole country. On his mother's side, a great educator. It was not common, by the way, at that time for women to work when they're married. But he got to see this double educated parents. The mother's ancestors fought in the Civil War, the United States Colored Troop. And then everyone always talks about Dr. Alain Locke as being a free man. You know, Mr. Abbott, his parents just escaped slavery. Well, you know, we don't just become free in this country. How did Mr. Locke become free? Well, let's go back. This gentleman, Charles Shorter, his ancestor, in 1785, was born in D.C. Have you heard of Charles Shorter before? Probably not. What did he do? Well, he fought in the War of 1812 for America, and he won his freedom. And then what did he do after that? He goes, well, now that I'm free, that vile institution of enslavement, I'm going to end that. So he became a member of the Underground Railroad. He was the stop right after William Still. William Still is the grandfather of the Underground Railroad. He's the one who taught Harriet Tubman everything she knows. So if you haven't heard of William Still, you should learn about him. But right, the next stop after William Still was Mr. Charles Shorter. So Harriet Tubman probably rode on the Underground Railroad with Charles Shorter. So this was the kind of lineage that Dr. Alain Locke had. But where did he go with that? Well, how many people here have a BA? How many people here have 2 BAs? How many have 3? How many have 4? Dr. Locke had 4. 4 BAs. First African American Rhodes Scholar. So this is a man of capacity. So when he calls Robert Abbott the spiritual emancipator of African Americans, that means something. And like Abdu'l-Baha, like Abbott, he also taught the diversity and the unity. So how did he do the diversity? How did he do the loving the other, honoring the other? Well, he talked about Abbott's paper. He wrote this book called The New Negro, which was to completely recast in our mind. Everyone was trying to hold these fairs to show African Americans as laborers. They wanted them to keep laboring like they did forever. And he goes, well, I'm going to show that we're poets, we're artists, we're playwrights, we're dancers. And he called the Chicago paper in his book, The New Negro, Chicago, home of the fearless, taunting race paper. So there was an interaction between Locke and Abbott, or a mutual admiration at least. And James Weldon Johnson, you know, who authored the African American National Anthem, for instance, which as recently as my wife's lifetime, they still teach in every school in D.C. I don't think that happens anymore. And he wrote of The New Negro, Dr. Locke's book. Because it shatters traditions and smashes stereotypes, it comes in the nature of a flashing revelation. There is not a more vitally important book for Americans now than The New Negro. So it's a good book to read that Dr. Locke edited. And I was recently watching an interview by Ossie Davis, who's an actor you might know, who was talking about how did Locke work? Like, how did he do this dean? How was he a dean of the Harlem Renaissance? Well, Ossie Davis gave 3 examples that I'll share. Langston Hughes was dishwashing in Paris, trying to become a poet over there. He brought him home, right, and put Langston Hughes to work in the Chicago Defender. He was the great writer for the Chicago Defender. Zora Neale Hurston, such a great author. She was so talented, like many people are. And she said, "You're especially good as a novelist. Please be a novelist. We need great novels." So she became a novelist with his guidance. Ozzie Davis walked into his office after writing a great philosophy paper. And Alain Locke said to Ozzie, he goes, "What do you want to be?" And Ozzie goes, "I want to be in theater." He goes, "Have you ever been to a theater?" He goes, "Oh, sure, I've been seeing some movies." It's like, "The theater, the thing you want to do. Have you ever been in a theater?" He's like, "Well, no, sir, I have not." He's like, "Drop out of Howard. Here's some of my friends in New York. They're just starting up a theater troupe in Broadway. Mention my name. Go join them. Sweep floors. Sell tickets. Dance. Sing. Act. Do whatever they ask. And then you'll know if you want to be in the theater or not." So you get a sense of that, of what kind of a dean he was. How he was marshalling along thousands of artists, bringing up talent, featuring them in his New Negro and elsewhere. So he was bringing them up. And the reason he was doing this, he felt, in his words, cultural recognition meets the conscious scrapping of the mood and creed of white supremacy. So if the best opera singers, if the best dancers, if the best musicians are African American, then you can no longer feel superior to them. So this shows a little bit of how Locke was working in that. And at the end of his life, did he feel he had accomplished that? Here's what he himself said, his final written statement in his life. "For the Negro seems at least on the verge of proper cultural recognition. Good. And of fraternal acceptance as a welcome participator and collaborator in the American arts. Should this become the realized goal, the history of the Negro's strange and torturous career in American literature may become also the story of America's hard-won but easily endured attainment of cultural democracy." So he's taking in that upliftment and then he's sharing it, saying this is all of America's. So he's demonstrating to us how to do this difficult task of unity and diversity without doing unity by uniformity, by saying, "I don't see color, I don't see these people." So, if you think about one of the most significant moments in Dr. Alain Locke, as I switched to how did he teach unity, was when he became the first African American in history to help author an official translation of religious scripture. This was the first time in the history of humanity, and it was Dr. Alain Locke. He edited with Shoghi Effendi the Kitab-i-Khan, which is one of the key texts of Baha'i scripture. And afterwards, in 1930, The Guardian wrote him, and in his words, "I express my deep appreciation of your valued suggestions in connection with the translation of the Khan. I have always greatly admired your exceptional abilities." And just like that, you have this incredible moment where Alain Locke is now helping unite the whole humanity through religious scripture. For he was the greatest philosopher America has yet produced. You will not know him because we don't talk of him in this way, but as you read his writings and as you get inspired by today's talk to learn everything you can about these two great gentlemen, he established multiculturalism. That's how all Americans think about this crazy idea of combining unity with diversity together without creating sameness and uniformity. Right? Multiculturalism. He was the one who put that idea forward. This was his philosophy. Avoid assimilation. Avoid separatism. We need unity and diversity. Democratic cultural pluralism is the word that he used. He said, what the contemporary mind stands greatly in need of is the divorce of the association of uniformity with the notion of the universal. Sameness in difference. Sameness in difference may be a difficult concept for us, but the difficulty is the specific blight and malady of the modern Western mind. She says, that's exactly what we have to imagine. Sameness in difference. We need to learn most is how to discover unity and spiritual equivalent underneath the difference which at present so disunite and sunder us. What he calls the tile differences. These are my tiles. They're sundering us. We must learn to discover the unity and spiritual equivalence. So now, it took me half an hour just to give that little talk? I'm going to share with you a minute of Alain's voice. He's going to give what I just gave in a minute so powerfully. He's going to talk on the one hand how great spirituals are. These are the African American freedom songs. I opened with my Estonian freedom songs. All people who have been enslaved or serfed for 600 years, like Estonians, or 300 years like African Americans, have songs, because when we're working in the field, all we can do is our voice. So you better believe we'll sing. So these songs, he talks about these songs. On the one hand, to uplift the African American, but you'll see how quickly and how swiftly and effectively he switches into unity. So let's hear from Alain Locke and appreciate how he did all these things I just described. But as you hear his words and his eloquence, you can picture how much you wish you were alive in the time of Alain Locke to have him counsel you on your challenges of implementing sameness and difference.
Connected to Leonard's iPhone.
Just 1 minute.
The spirituals are the taproot of our folk music, stemming generations down from the core of the group experience in the body and soul suffering of slavery, and expressing for the race, for the nation, for the world, the spiritual fruitage of that hard experience. But they are not merely slave songs or even Negro folk songs. The very elements that make them spiritually expressive of the Negro make them at the same time deeply representative of the soil that produced them. They constitute a great and now increasingly appreciated body of regional American folk song and music. As unique spiritual products of American life, they become nationally as well as racially characteristic. They also promise to be one of the profitable wellsprings of native idiom in serious American music. In that sense, they belong to a common heritage, and properly appreciated and used, can be, should be, will be a part of the cultural tie that binds.
Yabahalabha. So grateful that we have that talk from him from 1940. So that was the kind of gentleman he was. And he not only, like I said, philosophically worked on these items of unity, in scripture worked on unity, giving great speeches, but he also worked hard directly on the race amity committees of Washington, D.C., and the National Committee from 1924 to 1934. He wrote New Negro in 1925, so it's right in the middle of all that time. In 1921, I want to talk specifically, he was the chair of the Race Amity Convention here in D.C. And, of course, if I go back to Abbott, Abbott says these conferences, he calls them, the principal effort made by American Baha'is to further racial amity has been through a series of interracial amity conferences. So, as I keep going back between Abbott and Locke, Abbott now says what Locke was doing was pretty good, too. And so he was in charge of the Friday night session. And as you could imagine, with his extensive relationship in the artistic world, he delivered that to the conference that night. The Howard Conservatory of Music presented Hiawatha Trilogy. The Hiawatha Trilogy you'll also find in the museum I've talked about down on the mall. Because Samuel Coleridge Taylor, an African-British composer, composed this. And the Baha'i Harry Gibbs Marshall here led the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Appreciation Society in America. And they invited him here from time to time to speak and perform. Harry Gibbs Marshall, by the way, ran a music school down 9th and T Street that taught the gentleman who taught, people like, anyway, it was a portion of the music down there, and part of the Harlem Renaissance. But another thing that's hard to get your mind around is the participation of a solo violinist. Right nowadays, we don't think of a violinist as the leading musician in the country, but at that time it was exactly so. Joseph Douglas, the grandson of the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, was a concert violinist who we have to think about in modern terms, like a Michael Jackson. Like the most popular musician was performing at the Race Amity Conference that night. He was the first violinist of any race to be recorded. He was the first African-American violinist to travel intercontinentally. He was the first African-American violinist to travel nationally on tour. He was introduced by his father at the Columbia Exposition in 1893, which Baha'is know is the first time Baha'u'llah was mentioned in America. And so this is the kind of caliber of art and spirit that Locke brought to that event. And so what was the effect of this conference on America? Did we have an effect? So I turned to the preeminent historian of the event, Louis George Gregory, who wrote in Racial Amity in America, a Historical Review. He talked about what happened in 1921. He said the workers at the conference had unusual experiences, and the spirit of reconciliation seemed to sweep the city. Because it's just 2 years before, as a result of all that great migration, when the World War I soldiers returned to town, they found hundreds of thousands of African Americans they didn't know anything about. So they literally tried to riot them and attack them, and literally assassinate them 2 years earlier. So this Racial Amity Conference was in that milieu that we were holding it. And Louis Gregory continued, the assembling and cooperating of two groups traditionally separated, this was a completely segregated town in 1921, lifted the matter of race relations to a plane never before contemplated by those who had hitherto felt its burden. An interesting after effect of the first Amity Conference was the stimulus it gave to the Orthodox people who started the organization of interracial committees very soon thereafter. So people witnessed, just like Ida B. Wells wanted, right, back in 1912, that the spiritual speaks to the issue of lynching. Here again, the Baha'is displayed how it happens in 1921, when that wonderful music, when the wonderful talks of Locke and others. So one of those Orthodox churches in the area that started an interracial conference was led by Pastor John LaForge Jr. And the reason I want to share a story, because it's just one veil, you can just imagine there's many others, one veil of that influence. So John LaForge Jr. had been working on the Eastern Shore where there were lynchings right up until 1933, right? So this is Eastern Shore. This is like the South, right? This is real South. He was one of those brave pastors who was serving there. So he knew the racial issues. He wrote extensively. He wrote many great books about race relations and what should be done. And he's saying, no, the African Americans are suffering there because they're not getting any opportunities. No, there's no inferiority here. He came to the notice of the Pope. Which Pope? Pius XI asked Pastor LaForge to author an encyclical for him. And get this title, On the Unity of the Human Race. It's known as the Lost Encyclical because none of you know about it. Why? Because the Pope died before he read it and published it. So we literally have an encyclical written by the Pope, which is really written by Mr. LaForge, who was in this area from 1911 to 1926. So he was here when the Race Amity Conference happened. And somebody who's so involved, he probably attended. And Louis Gregory told us that as a result of the Amity communities, all the Orthodox churches began these Race Amity groups. So Mr. LaForge then wrote on the unity of the human race. And in 1995, the researchers, some French researchers, found it and published it. So now it's available for all of you. You can read the Pope's statements. What would have it done to the world in 1939 if it was published on the eve of World War II? So that's just to show that these things can have great effects because we're changing how we talk. Religion has something to say that's vital about race relations. Unity in diversity. So I now ask you all to think about how are you going to stand on the broad shoulders of Alain Locke, on the broad shoulders of Mr. Robert Abbott. How do you press forward these social meanings of unity and diversity to counter divisive social meanings? What do I mean by divisive social meanings? Well, Ken Morris, who is actually the great-grandson of Joseph Douglas, who was playing the violin at the Race Amity Conference, he also happens to be the great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. So he has Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass' blood flowing in him. And how did brave Ken Morris handle this kind of pedigree? He's tried to take his father's abolitionism and make it modern. It's not just something for African Americans to cherish in our hearts. Boy, I'm grateful for Mr. Frederick Douglass. I mean, that's unbelievable work, and it is unbelievable work. But he says, we have more slaves today in the world than we did then. He's now founded a foundation with his family to fight modern-day slavery. That's an example of how you take a social meaning and you change it to be more effective. Abolitionism is still needed. It's not something from the past. Similarly, my wife was relating to me an experience at a drugstore a few months ago. And we were in the beauty aisle. And then I go, I can't find what we're looking for you. And she goes, oh, it's in the colored aisle. Right? We have segregation in all of our drugstores, right under our eye. So when you think you're so far removed from 1940, that if you were in 1940, you would have been saying, no, I'm going to let my African American brothers in the front door instead of the back door, like the Baha'is in DC did until 1960. To think you're so far that that's so impossible for you to participate? Think of how you operated when you passed the aisle in the drugstore. Did you think about it? When you go past the Hallmark aisle. I was talking to an interracial Baha'i couple last night. How do they feel that they have a colored section of cards and a whites-only section of cards in every single drugstore, every single Hallmark aisle, everywhere in the country? And all of us so comfortably walk by that. Are you bothered by it? Do you start shuffling them up? Or are you fine with colored only, whites only? Where is the vision of interracial unity that Abbott put forward in his paper so effectively? So, I wish to conclude that we must all summon our fellow Americans to a level of consciousness far above mere social liberalism and tolerance. These are the words of the Universal House of Justice, who leads the Baha'i faith today. Far above social liberalism and tolerance, not just equality. I don't just tolerate all of you attending here today. With interventions such as the gentle but dramatic act of marriage between European and African descent Americans, and set the standard for Americans as to the real meaning of racial integration. This is what we do, and on a fresh platform and fresh media. We won't use newspapers, we'll use podcasts, we'll use other means, but we need still to keep challenging divisive social meetings and replace them with unity in diversity, which means both upliftment and means uniting without uniformity. So thank you. I hope you've all learned a lot about Mr. Abbott and Locke. I encourage you to read much more, go visit the museum, and experience us freedom singers and how we attempt to express ourselves. So thank you very much for your attention today.